Welcome to the Golf Improvement Podcast, episode 195.
Welcome to the podcast for golf lovers and enthusiasts who are looking to take their games to new heights. Dedicated to custom club fitting, short game improvement, and effective practice to improve your golf game. This is the Golf Improvement Podcast with your host, Tony Wright.
Hello, this is Tony Wright from Game Improvement Golf in Oak Ridge, Tennessee with the Golf Improvement Podcast, dedicated to sharing useful information on professional club fitting, short game improvement, and effective practice techniques, changing golfers' lives, one golfer at a time. I was thinking of titling this interview Hiding in Plain Sight, but that title doesn't do total justice to John Sherman's new book, The 4 Foundations of Golf. As I suggested in a blog I wrote about a month or so ago, John's book is, in my view, indeed the golf improvement book of 2022. It was a delight to get him to share just a few of the insights for golf improvement that he shares in his book. Enjoy this wonderful interview with John Sherman, creator of the Practical Golf website and author of The 4 Foundations of Golf.
Tony Wright and Game Improvement Golf, changing golfers' lives, one golfer at a time.
Hello, this is Tony Wright with episode 195 of the Golf Improvement Podcast. And it's a great pleasure today to get to learn from and let you all listeners learn from John Sherman, creator of the Practical Golf website and author of a really great new golf improvement book, The 4 Foundations of Golf, How to Build a Game That Lasts a Lifetime. John, on his website, it says he spent more than 20 years looking for ways to improve his personal game, and actually he's done quite a lot of improvement in his game. And he shares a lot of that wisdom both on his website and in his new book. And it really is practical information that you share here. You know, it's you do talk about ball flight laws, and you talk about some things interesting, like, and we're not going to cover today, like golf tempo, but the things we're going to talk about today are things I think that pretty much anybody can implement in their games and see improvement. So, John, thanks for being with me today.
Well, thanks, Tony. I appreciate the very warm introduction and having me on your show. And yeah, happy to talk about the website and the book and just let people know a little bit more about what I'm trying to do to help golfers get better.
Well, let's start out and share a little bit about your personal golf story, how your game improved from some of the concepts that you learned and discussed in the book, maybe a little bit about why you created Practical Golf, and also why you took the leap to write, and you know, what is it, almost 400 pages of information, to write The 4 Foundations of Golf.
Sure. Just to quickly summarize my story, and I always try and make this distinction early, is that I am not a swing instructor. I am a golfer. You can think of me as a player coach. And, you know, I was always, I got bit by the golf bug when I was 11. I share that story early in the book of finding an old set of golf clubs in my grandmother's garage. And I, like many others, I became obsessed with the game at an early age. I think I was a decent competitor in high school and a little bit in college, nothing exceptional. And, you know, after I graduated college, I had a really difficult relationship with golf. I really didn't enjoy it for years. And, you know, over the last 7 or 8 years, I had kind of a rebirth and learned a lot, got a lot better. And that was really the genesis of Practical Golf. I wanted to help players not only enjoy the game more, but improve. And I thought that my perspective as a golfer could help and talk about all the topics really outside of the golf swing that I thought were being ignored. So that is why I started the site 8 years ago. And all of the hundreds of articles I've written over the years, I realized, well, I've got to organize that and turn it into something much bigger. So that my work on the site laid the foundation for, no pun intended, the 4 foundations of golf. So that's who I am. I'm trying to help golfers get better from the perspective of another golfer, and thankfully that viewpoint has helped a few people.
And you say in your sort of about page, I noticed this after I had written a couple things down, too much instruction, not enough coaching. Boy, that hurts a lot of people, doesn't it?
I try and be fair. I think when I first started this site, I'll be honest with you, maybe I had a little bit too much of a chip on my shoulder. Yeah. And since then, as I've connected much more deeply with instructors and learned from a lot of them, I have a whole chapter in the book about this, and I've taken a ton of golf lessons over the years. I haven't taken one in 10 years, but the last one I got, I probably wouldn't be here talking to you today if I didn't get it. So I am a huge proponent of swing lessons, of getting customized technical advice for your golf swing. And I talk about that in the book, about how to go about it, what I believe is the right way. What I am against, though, is golfers who are stuck on the endless hamster wheel of swing tips. There's more information than ever, and I don't fault the instructors for sharing it. Being a golf instructor is a tough job for a number of reasons, and with that, with the popularity of online lessons and giving out information, now golfers have more information than ever on the golf swing. So you can go on YouTube or Instagram. I'm sure TikTok now. I don't go on there, but there's just so much information. And I do try and discuss that in the book. Is the problem is relevancy and what's relevant to your swing. So, to hopefully not offend any swing instructors listening to this, is that I'm certainly pro golf instruction, but what I am against is golfers overdosing on swing tips. That's a very famous Harvey Penick quote. That's where we get into trouble, because we can't play golf. We're going to be stuck on the course with 20,000 conflicting thoughts in your head before you swing. That's what I'm trying to prevent. So hopefully that gives a well-rounded explanation of what I think about instruction.
Yeah, and as you said, there is a great chapter in the book about that, and it's definitely worth reading. Well, there is so much meat, I think, in the book, as I thought back after I had read it, about expectation management. I mean, it kind of comes through over and over and over and over, okay? And share your views on why it's so important. But there were a few things that immediately when I read them in the whole book, just like, oh, wow, and one of them, and you've tweeted about this, is, that PGA Tour players make bogey about 80% of the time in recovery situations. So why should we think that we are the superhero, right?
Isn't that a crazy stat?
That is an unbelievable stat. Yeah.
That was from Mark Brody's book, Every Shot Counts, which is also, I believe, a must-read for every golfer. I believe not just in golf, but in life in general, expectation management is really the key to success and happiness. When we think about the burden we place on ourselves with golf or anything else we're trying to get better at, sometimes or often unrealistic expectations hinder our enjoyment and our progress. And I've found that through the years of writing articles online, that topic alone has connected with so many golfers. And I chose to start off the book with expectation management because I truly believe if you can't get that part of the game right, nothing else is going to work. Your practice, your strategy, the mental game, of course, whatever technical work you're going to do on the golf swing, which is not part of my book, but that's also important. So I do talk a lot about my own struggles in the game. I talk a lot about PGA Tour statistics just because, when we watch golf on TV, it's a bit of a highlight reel and it gives us unrealistic expectations of what we can expect out of this game. So I view it as really the cornerstone of golf because I know that I was way too hard on myself for years, and I know plenty of other golfers who read my site or are listening to this are generally too hard on themselves, and they don't understand what good shots are for their skill level. They don't know how to pick proper targets because of that. So it's a broad topic, and it really bleeds into everything else in golf. So I view it as it's just fundamental. It's everything to me.
And let me give you another perspective to it, and particularly when you're struggling. I'm right now in a little, you talked about you struggling, but I'm a little struggling with, with my game and scoring and things like that. In some ways, it almost gets more important when you're struggling because
absolutely,
yeah, then you're saying, oh, I got to do this better, or I have to hit it closer, or this or that. I mean, you just have to deal with what's possible.
So yeah, there is an inherent variability to golf that is very difficult for even the best in the world to wrap their heads around. You hear these stories about, PGA Tour golfers, guys who miss like 20 cuts in a row and then all of a sudden they win. It's just wild what can happen in this game. And unfortunately, when we're in a bit of a rut, that's when it's hardest to see the, I guess what cliche am I looking for here? The sun beyond the clouds, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
There's a million phrases for that. But, when we go through our inevitable struggles in this game, it's hard to remain patient. And then we start maybe going into overdrive. And that's when, golfers are just, they're kind of on a lifeboat looking for anyone to help them. So that's when almost things get worse, because now I'll watch any video to help my swing, or I'll listen to any guy on the range who's willing to give me tips, rather than just kind of sticking to the script. And hopefully I'm giving people a good script in the book to stick to. But yeah, I mean, I go through it myself. This season's been very interesting for me. I've played some of my absolute best golf ever, especially in tournaments. And then I've had a few rounds, lately kind of interjected between some good golf, specifically in tournaments, that were just really head scratchers for me. And I think the old me would have probably lost his temper and maybe his mind completely. And not that those rounds weren't frustrating for me, but I simply, at the end of it, I was like, that's golf. Some days you step up on the course and things are just not going to go well. And you have to do your best with, hopefully a toolkit that you have to minimize the damage. And then more importantly, realize that, that doesn't mean you're doomed for the next month or two. It's just one round. It could just be, a string of bad rounds. That is unfortunately just part of this game. It's a very variable game, and it's hard to accept that.
Yeah, and I know you've talked with Scott Fawcett quite a number of times in Decade, and so much of the stuff that he talks about is just, well, he just opened so many people's eyes to
Absolutely.
All of that. Yeah.
I've been on the phone with Scott probably 3 times in the last 4 days. We talk a lot about that stuff on the phone, and his work with Decade has been super influential to what I've done, and probably why he's the most cited person in my book. Not only just because of his strategy, but because of, his ability to communicate expectation management as well. Like we're both in agreement that, you can call it mental game, strategy, expectation management. They're all really the same thing. Because when you're on the course, and let's say you've had a bad start to your round, what do golfers do? They typically start changing things. They lose discipline. They start getting maybe a little bit more aggressive. We spoke about that 80% bogey stat earlier. You hit a few shots in the tree, and all of a sudden the opening in the tree starts looking bigger, and you're like, maybe I can thread this through there. And then all of a sudden, what could have been a routine bogey turns into a quadruple, and you've poured gasoline on the fire, so to speak. So, these are the challenges that the game gives us on the course. It's just every shot is a test of rational thinking, emotional control. And if you don't have a basic framework to work with, which I don't think a lot of golfers are taught, and why I wrote the book, then you just kind of, I always say this phrase, you're changing lanes in a traffic jam and getting nowhere. There's this great movie called Office Space, one of the great comedies of all time. And the opening scene is the guy stuck in a traffic jam. He keeps changing lanes and he's going nowhere. And that's, I think, a great metaphor for golf sometimes. So yeah, it's a hard game. It's challenging. And I'm just trying to give people some ideas on how they can minimize that damage when things aren't going well, and then make your better rounds a little bit better.
Now, another big part of the book was, Chapter 15, and golf is a game of proximity. And I have a friend who's about 82 years old, and he hits the ball pretty well, but he just plays a set of tees that are perfect for him. And I'll bet he's shot his age, 30, 40 times a year. He has such a delight in his game. And it's not that he's not playing the right tees. They're perfect, but he has a consistent game. It fits. But the whole issue and the whole thing of it being a game of proximity and how important it is to understand that and hit your drivers in the right place and all those kind of things. Talk a little bit about your perspective on on that part of the book?
So this was a part of the game that I got wrong for a very long time. And I try and profusely thank Mark Brody and Scott Fawcett for opening my eyes up to it several times throughout the book, particularly with tee shot strategy. So I think taking up the game as a junior golfer and kind of the prevailing wisdom for decades was that, safety first off the tee and laying back was the better strategy. But what we found out, especially when Brody came out with strokes gained, was that, I think we gave too much emphasis on lateral dispersion, meaning left to right and hitting fairways. And we did not factor in what distance was costing us. So, I was the guy who took 4 irons off the tee because I was scared.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize that, because of that decision, laying back 30, 40, 50 yards, I'm already losing strokes. You can quantify that now. 25 yards is worth anywhere from a quarter of a stroke to a third of a stroke for golfers, especially as handicaps go higher. Distance is even more important. So that's a very important theme off the tee, and it bleeds into everything in golf. Like one example I give in the book is that if you want to see how two golfers separate themselves in terms of scoring, you could do this fairly easily on the course. And you could do it with a PGA Tour player and a 15 handicap. If you started off with a putting competition from 20 feet, I can tell you mostly what would happen. Both of those players would two-putt a lot. Maybe the PGA Tour player would sink a few, maybe if you were changing targets each time so they didn't know the break. And, the 15 handicap would two-putt most of the time also. Maybe there's a three-putt in there. But you really wouldn't see a stark difference in their game. But as you start moving further and further away from the hole, maybe you had a chipping competition from 20 yards or 50, 70 yards. As you got further and further away and you worked your way up to maybe a 180-yard approach shot, then you would start seeing the difference between the two. The tour player would be hitting a ton of greens, keeping it 30, 40, 50 feet from the hole, and the 15 handicap would be chunking a few, sculling a few. Maybe they hit a couple on the green, but now you'd start to see, okay, this is the difference between these two players. And then if you start going off the tee, then the PGA Tour player is hitting at 310 and the 15 handicap's hitting at 230. So I try and make that point in the book over and over again because it means a lot. It means a lot for strategy. It means a lot for what you're prioritizing in your game in terms of practice. I think a lot of golfers can find more distance off the tee. You're a club fitter, you know how to do that. I think there's some practice methods I share that can do that. But generally speaking, the further you are away from the hole, the harder this game gets. And that is where golfers separate more from one another as they get further away from the hole.
It's also fun to hit it a little bit further too sometimes if you can.
Of course. Yeah, who doesn't like to hit their driver 20 yards further? And really, to be quite honest, that's a very achievable goal for a lot of golfers without a crazy amount of work.
Yeah, it definitely is. One of the things I thought was really neat, and there's so many old school type statistics that we now know are not really good, or if you really care about improving. But one of the old school stats that really, really is very good is greens in regulation. And I also see a little perspective from reading the book about, just being a little more relaxed about hitting pitches and chips and things like that and just getting the ball on the green.
Absolutely.
Is way more important than most of us think, and that's probably because we want to hit these fancy shots, right? Talk a little bit about those two perspectives.
Sure. So I think most importantly, the first thing I'd like to cover is that a lot of golfers, and me for a very long time, assume that lowering your handicap is more through exceptional shot making, meaning like hitting it close to the pin, hitting that 30-yard pitch shot 5 feet away and tapping in for par. And just really having these miraculous outcomes on the golf course. And what I've found to be true is my handicap got lower and lower was that it was quite boring. It was really mistake avoidance that led me to the quote unquote promised land. So, I try and share stats in the book, especially from recreational players. Like you mentioned wedge play. A good wedge shot for just about any level of golfer from around the green or inside 50 yards, if you can keep it inside of a 20-foot window, you've done pretty well for yourself. And becoming a better wedge player is more about avoiding those, double chips or those. I do this from time to time. I'll scull one over the green still. It's very frustrating. Getting the ball on the putting surface most of the time and just giving yourself a two putt for your bogey or an opportunity to make that par putt. That's the biggest part of the battle. It's not being Seve or Phil and hitting these flop shots, especially when you're short-sighted, still trying to get it close to the hole. It's more about just getting it on the green and giving yourself an easy two putt. And that, that theme occurs in other parts of the game, especially approach play, which we now know is the most important part of the game for scoring, thanks to Mark Brody. That's why I still think greens in regulation is a great stat to keep track of, because it's the only stat where you can see a very clear correlation between hitting more greens and lowering handicap level. It holds up. A 5 handicap is going to hit more greens in regulation than a 15 handicap. It's almost impossible to buck that trend. But when you look at like fairways hit and putts per round, there's some very misleading trends there. So I often tell people to look deeper in strokes gained and other ways to track your stats. So yeah, I view greens in regulation as kind of the simple gold standard to aspire to. I tell people just build your game around hitting more greens, and that means a lot of things, but that is generally the best path to lowering your scores because approach play is so important.
Yeah. And as I'm talking to you, as I'm thinking about watching, and I don't watch nearly as much tour golf as I should, but there are plenty of times when they're short-sighted where they do not hit a great shot.
No.
That they simply don't, that they leave it a little short or hit 20 feet past. And, sometimes, and a lot of times they hit some magical thing, but boy, oh boy, those guys struggle a lot with that too.
Yeah. And, to be on tour, if you played with any tour player, even one that was considered a poor wedge player, like I'm thinking of why am I blanking on his name? The Norwegian kid. Oh my God, how am I forgetting his name?
And he's
number 8 in the world.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's great that I'm forgetting his name right now. But he's considered a horrible wedge player by tour standards. But if you or I played around with them, we'd be like, oh my God, this guy's the best wedge player in the world. But yeah, I mean, even under the pressure of the PGA Tour, when you're short-sighted in the bunker or in the rough and you don't have much green to work with, like that's a big challenge for them. And certainly a regular golfer, that's one of those situations where they need to take their medicine. If you only have 10 feet between you and the pin, and you're trying to thread the ball in between the rough and the green, between the pin, you're setting yourself up for disaster. And I talk about that in the book. A simple adjustment people can make is just, all right, I'm going to try and land this 10 to 15 feet beyond the pin, take my medicine and get out of here with the par, because ultimately double bogey and worse avoidance, again, not to sound like a bummer to people, but that is what separates the high handicaps from the low handicaps, the double, the triple, quadruple bogeys. They just don't make as many of them. It's not necessarily the pars, and it's definitely not the birdies.
Yeah. Now, I'm drawing a blank, too, about something, but the phrase zombie rain sessions was something that you talked about, I think, on Twitter in a recent article about the book, right?
First, let me just say it's Victor Hovland. I Googled
Victor Hovland, that's right.
I can't believe I forgot Victor's name because I'm actually quite a big fan of his, but let's just get that out of the way.
Yeah, there you go. He will be happy if he listens here. But I can't remember. There was an article, I don't know if it's golf.com or somewhere, and they talked about zombie rain sessions. Yes. Talk a little bit about why you use that term, but you also said, and it's just so obviously true in some ways, engagement is the most important factor in practicing that makes any sense, okay? That really gets you better.
Yeah. Well, first off, I mean, obviously you've taken your notes on the book, so thank you for doing that. But yeah, I was fortunate enough to have an article on golf.com about my book. And I think one of the main topics that Luke from golf.com got from the book was that concept of zombie range sessions, which I've talked about for years. So when I want to talk to a golfer about becoming better at practice and then solving that problem that everyone has is I was hitting it so well on the range and then I went to the course and I stunk. Where was that golfer? They didn't exist. And a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it has to do with engagement and intent while practicing. I think a lot of golfers default to what I call zombie range sessions, where they are just rifling through the bucket. I used to do this, still maybe fall victim to it sometimes. And you're hitting the same shot. You're not really thinking about what you're doing. You're not picking a target. You're not creating any type of scenario that's even remotely close to what you're going to face on the golf course. So I always share the example of a 7-iron. If you hit 20, 25 7-irons in a row and you're just hitting, not thinking about it, nothing. Eventually you're going to settle into a groove and you're going to start hitting a bunch of good shots. I think a lot of golfers are capable of that. But you're not building any skills. And then you're certainly not going to transfer that performance over to the course because you haven't taken the time to do what you would have done on the course, which is pick a target, hopefully go through some type of pre-shot routine, actually put pressure on yourself to hit that target or get the ball close to it. These are all things that happen on the golf course that confuse and frustrate people, but they're not trying to mimic those conditions in practice at all. So it sounds almost too good to be true, but the basic thing I start off the practice session with is just you have to have intent on every shot. And that means a lot of things, but at the most basic form is just having a target. I know that sounds ridiculous to people, but a lot of golfers just hit balls on the range and they don't even take the time to establish their target. And because of that, they can't analyze the appropriate feedback. Where did it end up? How was the ball flight? How was the contact with the face? How was ground contact? All things I talk about in the practice session. Those are how you make adjustments and you pay attention and get better and build your skills. So that's I think the battle I'm trying to fight with most golfers is getting them away from those zombie range sessions. And I'm not asking people to practice for 2 hours. I don't like practicing that long. I'm saying give it 20, 30, 40 minutes of quality engaged practice and maybe with some of the methods I discuss. And I believe you'll have far better performance on the course than if you rifled through 250 balls without thinking about what you're doing.
And you also talk about one of my favorite things to tell golfers about, and when I do fittings, and that is Dr. Scholl's and how anybody that really wants to get better at ball striking should have a can of that somewhere around.
I always joke there's got to be some mid-level manager at Dr. Scholl's who must know at this point that the golf industry has found out about this, because it's just such a basic. When I introduced the foot spray thing to people, and of course I did not invent this. A lot of people have figured this out, where you spray your driver face or your iron face and you hit a bunch of shots, and then you're like, wow, I'm hitting a bunch on the heel or I'm hitting a bunch on the toe. That's what that feels like. Now let me try and move strike around. It's unbelievable what can happen. And I do it to this day. Like, for example, my tendency as a ball striker is to miss it on the heel. And you know this as a club fitter, that's a much bigger problem with the driver because now you've got gear effect. And I've been healing it lately with my driver in some tournaments, and now I'm going to work on that. I'm going to spray the face in practice. I'm going to be engaged about where I'm trying to strike it on the face. I'm paying attention to the feedback of where it's actually occurring. And then I'm going to try and make some adjustments to move that strike location over. Perhaps I'm just going to try and strike it off the toe, and that magically solves things sometimes. So these are super basic things that I think a lot of people never heard about. People like you and many others have figured it out. And I'm just trying to bring these to light so that when a golfer shows up to the range, they've got these choices they can make between practice methods that I think will be way more productive. And it just doesn't get as fundamental as strike location. It solves, and you know this very well, Tony, it solves a lot. Yeah. If you can get it closer to the center of gravity, the golf club can do what it's designed to do.
And you talked about, and I can't remember the phrase you used in the book, but you mentioned a little bit here that, just trying to vary. And what were the words you used in the book for that? I can't remember. Just trying to vary your strike location just gets you so many pieces of information that you normally don't get. And there was a phrase you had in the book, I think.
I have a practice method that I would call it fight fire with fire.
That's the one.
Right. So I just, and again, a lot of people have figured this out for decades. A lot of pretty good golfers figure this out. If you're hitting it too high, try and hit it low. If you're hitting a slice, try and hit a draw. I just truly believe in all of the experimentation I've done in practice, and then connecting people with people like Adam Young, who's my podcast co-host, and his wonderful book, The Practice Manual, that these forms of practice, when you are noticing a trend in your ball striking, whether that's trajectory, shot shape, where you're striking the ground, where you're making contact on the face, it can be as simple as trying to do the opposite can neutralize the inherent fault. This is one of like my core fundamentals of my practice. As someone who struggled with a hook, I step up to the ball trying to hit a fade a lot of the times on the course, and that just neutralizes my swing path. I mentioned before, if I'm struggling with striking on the heel of my driver, I might set up with it closer to the toe or intentionally try and strike the toe. And I won't hit the toe, but I'll probably move strike a little bit further away from the heel towards the center. Again, super basic, but if you spend time on this, doing these concepts on the range, I can pretty much guarantee most golfers that they're going to get some good results from this. So I call it my fight fire with fire practice method. You just try and do the opposite of the fault, and some magic can happen there.
Yeah. Two of the really, I call them, in the notes I sent you, home run concepts that I got out of the book were related to if you're trying to change something, besides things like fight fire with fire. But, James Clear is good about almost everything he does. But you quoted a phrase, the key to building lasting habits is focusing on creating a new identity first. And I never thought about that. And, your current behaviors are simply a reflection of your current identity, but also the importance of building a post-shot routine. And this is something I work with really hard with the kids I coach in putting for junior college, that it's just as important to reflect afterwards about what you did as it is to execute, okay?
Absolutely.
So talk about a little bit about those things in terms of making change and just helping you play your best.
Sure. So I think, and millions of people have figured this out as well. James Clear, his book Atomic Habits, it's been a bestseller for years now. It's one of the, I think it can change anyone's life, let alone their golf game. And it's why I quoted him in the book several times. He's someone who I think has figured out a lot of really, again, stuff that's been hiding in plain sight about habits. And he even says it in his book. He's like, nothing I write in here is revelatory or new. I've just, found a bunch of things. I'm going to kind of explore what I found out. And one of the things that he found out about habits was that, just writing down a goal, like if you say, I'm a 15 handicap, I want to be a 5 handicap, like that's not good enough. That's not going to materially change your golf game. What would be more important, what I think is what will lead to better golf, is changing your habits. So for example, in my own game, what was holding me back, I've tried to become a pretty good tournament player, and that's required me competing against a lot of college kids and scratch and plus level golf, plus handicap golfers. And I had to think about what was holding me back. And luckily, I became friendly with Scott Fawcett, and talking with him, I shared my fears of hitting my driver everywhere. And I pretty much mention this on every podcast I do because I have to give Scott credit for it. But he just sat me down. He's like, you're never going to get better or play well in tournaments if you don't embrace your driver. So essentially what I had to do is I had to change my identity as a golfer who was scared of their driver and convince myself that I just wasn't good with it and I couldn't use it. So I had to change my identity to someone who's like, I'm going to embrace my driver and figure this out. So along the way, changing my identity and believing in that, and of course, putting in the right practice and all those things, that led me to become someone who loves my driver now. And essentially I had to change. Same with putting. I used to be a dreadful putter, and now I'd consider myself a pretty good putter. I changed my identity. I just didn't, I thought about what had to change and the different habits that I would need to adjust to get there. But a lot of it was getting out of that rut and stop telling myself that I was never going to be a good driver of the ball or putter. These are problems you can solve. And I talk about grit in the book. I think grit's one of the ways to solve them, along with changing your habits. So I'm just a big believer in that versus just writing down a list of tangible goals, because sometimes people don't give themselves the roadmap to achieve them when they do that.
Now, how about the end of the part of the reflection part too? A little bit afterwards. So talk a little bit about that.
So a post-shot routine is super important. I actually had been figuring this out along the years and reading James Siekman's book, his wonderful wedge book. And I think one of the greatest things I got from his book was that takeaway of having a post-shot routine. And it really involves two things. One, it's going through an objective, non-emotional analysis of what occurred. So for a putt, for example, if you made your read, you picked your line, you went through your routine, and you hit the putt, and most of the time it's not going to go in, let's face it. Then you take a moment to absorb what happened. Did I push it or pull it? How was the contact on the face? Was the speed control good? Sometimes you can't figure these things out, but you're taking a moment to internalize what happened, again, in a non-emotional, objective way, not, oh, damn it, I missed that putt. I'm the worst.
Yeah, right.
Like that's what we tend to do to ourselves.
Yeah.
But I believe the great golfers I've been around, and certainly a change in my game, is that you take a moment to acknowledge what occurred. This doesn't have to be long. See if there was a piece of feedback in there that stuck out at you. And then just say, what could I have done differently? Maybe it was this. If not, fine. Move on to the next shot and do it all over again. Rather than, what we do on the course. Curse yourself, say, oh, you're the worst putter ever. You can't make anything. It's the emotion that really stops us from, I think, getting better. And I think having a post-shot routine, and more importantly, I talk about analyzing your round afterwards. All the clues for better golf are hiding in your rounds, and taking notes of these things. And then you can work on these in your practice sessions or make adjustments on the course for the next time. But you have to take a moment to absorb the information rather than just discard it or get angry at yourself. And that's hard to do, but the idea of a post-shot routine can be very fruitful to a lot of players.
Not many of us will do what Matt Fitzpatrick does, would we?
No, yeah. I mean,
Isn't that amazing?
It's incredible, but that's there is a spectrum in this game, and I don't expect people to go crazy. And that him taking having a database of every single shot he hit and the intent and where it ended up is mind-boggling. But it's he's the reigning U.S. Open champion, so it's worked for him. But that's a habit, right?
Yeah,
that is a habit of saying, after most shots, I'm just going to take a moment to objectively think about what occurred, not for a couple minutes, just for a few seconds, and then I'm going to move on to the next one. That's a habit. And I think if you stack these habits, and I think my book is really a list of what I think are positive habits for golfers, if you start picking a few of them and doing them over and over and over again, that's how you get better over time. It's not necessarily an overnight success, but that's the path to improvement, in my opinion.
Yeah. My youngest son, who's not young anymore, he likes to tell his sons this thing, aggregation of marginal gains. Now that sounds like a real complicated thing, but almost all of these little things, like not wasting a shot, not making a double bogey, there's some element of aggregation of marginal gains that's in there.
Yeah, I mean, everyone is essentially trying to say the same thing in different ways. That really is what coaching is.
Yeah.
Some people might not buy into my message. It might not resonate with them. And for others are like, wow, I've gotten some messages, thankfully, already. Like, I read your book and played my best round ever because I had a completely new mindset on the course. So I think a lot of coaches, whether it's golf, basketball, football, they're finding interesting ways to say the same things. And that concept that you talk about is, my term for it in the book over and over again is incremental progress.
Right.
James Clear calls it 1% better every day. It's this idea that you're stacking up these small, minor wins that are almost barely noticeable in the moment, but over time you look back and you're like, wow, the way I went from a 15 handicap down to a 5 wasn't, it wasn't one thing, but it was, I got a little bit smarter about practicing. I was a little bit more disciplined about picking smarter targets on the course. I got a routine that I could stick with before every shot that kind of calmed me down and focused me. It's all these little things that you do over and over again. And to be quite honest, there's a lot of minutia there. It's not exciting, but what is exciting is starting to post those lower scores and enjoying yourself more. And those stack up over time in very minor details, and they're hard to notice. And that's why so many golfers get frustrated, is because we're looking for these home runs that are like noticeable immediately. And to be honest, they're usually not there. It's the small things that add up.
Yeah. Yeah. That's pretty neat stuff. But golfers haven't, well, I don't know how much they've been told it, but they're getting to hear it more, like, for example, from your book.
Yeah. I mean, I think more than ever, we have access to better information. There's a lot of great coaches out there who've, taken what we've learned in prior generations and made the information better. And I'm sure someone 20, 30 years from now is going to go even further. And I think that's what progress is. And I do try and, I list this early in the book that golf is a game of nostalgia. And there are some things we got very wrong in this game, especially with strategy and some other stuff, and they need to be updated. But there's other timeless advice that I think golfers have figured out for decades. Harvey Penick's book is still very, very relevant. Like he just communicated these things so clearly, and that's why people can still get something out of that book. So I'm trying to bridge the gap between what I consider to be modern golf advice and then, timeless stuff that's kind of existed forever and people have figured out. And it's just, how can I communicate it in my own style and some stuff that I've figured out on my own. I think that's part of the challenge of golf and coaching in general. But yeah, there's definitely timeless information that I believe will make golfers good forever.
Yeah. Well, any particular things at the end here that you want to say to sort of, wrap things up or summarize? But also, I will mention that there's a neat little offer at the end of the book when you get to the end of it related to your website that I think was kind of a good thing. That I appreciated that. So.
Yeah, I offer a free little gift for people when they get to the end of the book, just to thank. I put this in the introduction. If I've been doing my website Practical Golf for almost 8 years now, and this book is the first thing that I've really has been my quote unquote big product. And if someone gives me money for my book, if they purchase it on Amazon, the Kindle's $18 and the paperback's $25, that means a lot to me. And I tried to inject as much value as I could into the book. And I tell people in the beginning, there's hundreds of ideas in here for you. All it takes are 2 or 3 light bulb moments to significantly change your game. So it does mean a lot to me that, people are buying the book and investing their money in it. And I want to make sure they get something significant out of it. So I gave them that. And then I gave them a little gift at the end of it as well to go on my website and get some more stuff. But that's, if that could be my closing statement on maybe why people should consider getting my book and how to read it, is that I try and give you tangible, easy to understand information on a wide variety of topics that I believe can really make a golfer of any level better relative to their time commitments and whatever else they want out of this game. Don't go crazy. You can only pick 2 or 3 things at a time, and I hope it's your reference guide for years to come. But yeah, that was something I thought long and hard about when I wrote it, is how can I, if someone reads this thing, how can I give them as much as I can in terms of, information that they can really use to improve, not just there's a lot of fluff out there, I believe, and I try and just spell it out very clearly and tell you exactly what to do, and hopefully I've achieved that.
I think you really summarized it great, too. You don't have to get 10 million things.
No, you can't.
You couldn't anyhow. You couldn't anyhow.
Exactly. I don't want you to, because I don't want you confused on the course. I want you to absorb as much as you can and then pick a few things.
And you'll know, somebody that's reading it, I think, will know when something, this really makes sense.
Yep.
I can do that.
I think so. Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, I think the early feedback I've gotten from some people is like, they'll read a chapter like, oh, I read your 2/3 rule chapter. That just changed everything for me. And that was worth the price of admission right there. Now they're on their way with a new concept in their game that I think will help them forever. And then the rest of it, was like, I like that, but that one really stuck out to me. So that's what I really do hope people get out of it, is that one or two things stick out so profoundly that it really can change things forever. Because that's, to be honest, in my own game, that's what it was for me. A few things stuck out over time, and I'm like, and I really clung on to them, and that was the difference between getting better and having more fun, more importantly.
Yeah. Well, it's a great book, and I'll put a link in the show notes to your site and to the book where they can buy it on Amazon. But it has to feel good to have gotten through all this and put this all together. It was quite a piece of work, and it's really worthwhile.
I really appreciate you taking the time to read it, all the kind things you've said about it. And it absolutely was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. It took me 3 years of on and off of writing it. I'm glad it's done. I'm relieved that people are liking it so far. And it just means a lot to me that, people like yourself are taking notice of it and having me on your show. I really appreciate that.
The Golf Improvement Podcast is sponsored by Tony Wright and Game Improvement Golf. Tony creates exceptional golf clubs. You shoot lower scores.
Thanks, John, for the culmination of 3 years of hard work to write a book that golfers at every level of performance can learn from to improve their games. I have absolutely no doubt that all golfers who want to improve their games, their scoring, and their fun on the golf course will find something, perhaps even many things, in the 4 foundations of golf that will help them to do this. I put a link in the show notes to John's Practical Golf website and to where you can purchase the 4 foundations of golf. And as I noted in the interview, John has a link at the end of the book so you can get free access to the premium part of his website, the Practical Golf Insider, which is a $50 value. My shout out today, no additional shout out for this post, because I want to keep the focus on, again, suggesting that you buy John's new book. A reminder that there's a Support Game Improvement Golf link in the show notes for this podcast, and if you can provide some support, that will be greatly appreciated. Contributions are continuing to help me move toward my $4,000 goal for upgrading my website and podcasting computer. Thanks. Well, that's it for today. In 2 weeks, an interview I'm very excited about doing with Lou Stagner, the Golf Stat Pro. Lou will share his top 10 and maybe more golf expectation myths that you need to unlearn to help you to play your best golf. Until then, take care, God bless Ukraine, and God bless America.
Game Improvement Golf, your source of information and inspiration to become an exceptional golfer now. www.gameimprovementgolf.com